Germany, 1912. The world was changing. Machines were learning to fly, nations were learning to hate, and a child named Hanna Reitsch was learning to dream. She was born in Hirschberg, in the province of Silesia, where the mountains met the clouds. Her father was a strict doctor, her mother gentle and devout, but it was the sky that raised her. As other girls played with dolls, Hanna climbed trees and watched the birds, fascinated by their effortless grace. When her parents asked what she wanted to become, she answered without hesitation, "A pilot." They laughed, not cruelly but with disbelief. "Girls don't fly, Hanna." "Then I'll be the first," she said. The calling of the wind. In those early years of the 1920s, flight was still poetry. Planes were fragile, loud, unpredictable, yet to Hanna, they were freedom made visible. She would sneak to the nearby glider field, where young men in leather jackets threw their wooden crafts off the hillside, trusting wind and faith. When one of them crashed, she didn't run away. She ran toward him, memorizing the angle of his wings, the shape of his courage. Soon the pilots began to notice her, a curious, fearless girl with bright eyes and sharper questions. One of them, amused, let her sit inside the cockpit of a broken glider. The smell of oil and canvas, the tight grip of the stick, that was the moment she later called my baptism of air. Defying gravity, defying rules, her family wanted her to become a doctor like her father. She agreed, on paper. She enrolled at the University of Breslau to study medicine, but spent every free hour at the glider school. Her instructors were skeptical at first. A woman? In their ranks? But the sky had no patience for prejudice. On her third day of training, she launched from the slope of the Riesengebirge and stayed aloft for 32 seconds, a lifetime in the thin mountain air. When she landed, her instructor muttered, "You'll kill yourself doing this." She smiled. "Then I'll die happy." That smile would follow her for the rest of her life, bright, fearless, and terrifying in its conviction. A nation in turbulence. The Germany of Hanna's youth was a country of humiliation and hunger. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles had stripped it of pride and power. But in the airfields, Reich not just a pilot, but propaganda with a human face. Between sky and shadow. When she first met Ernst Udet, a World War I ace and now one of the leaders of the new Luftwaffe, he greeted her with a grin. "You fly like a devil, Fräulein. We could use that." He introduced her to test pilot programs, secret, experimental, and dangerous. There, she flew prototypes that others refused to touch, aircraft that stalled, spun, and sometimes exploded mid-air. But fear was something she didn't seem to understand. Colleagues would recall how she walked away from crashes smiling, dusting herself off like a dancer who had tripped mid-performance. "Flying," she said, "is not about living, it's about becoming infinite." That kind of talk made generals nervous and inspired the Führer. A dangerous faith. When Adolf Hitler first met her in the late 1930s, he saw more than a pilot. He saw a symbol, a perfect image of the new German woman, disciplined, loyal, beautiful, and utterly fearless. He praised her as the embodiment of German willpower. She blushed, not from admiration of the man, but of the recognition. The leader of a nation had seen her, had promised her the sky. She left that meeting radiant, writing in her diary, "He spoke of purity and flight, of the rebirth of Germany. I believe he is giving us wings again." That faith would be her tragedy. The edge of heaven. By the outbreak of World War II, Hanna Reitsch had become the first woman to receive the Iron Cross for service to the Luftwaffe. She tested new aircraft, risked her life for each innovation, and appeared in propaganda films as the smiling angel of German aviation. But behind the glamour lay obsession, a woman consumed by flight, blind to where her wings were taking her. "The higher I flew," she later wrote, "the smaller the world below became. And when the world disappears, so does conscience." She began as a girl who loved the wind. She became a woman who no longer heard the storm. Berlin, 1935. The air above the capital shimmered with the roar of engines. Germany was waking from its humiliation, and the Reich's banners now fluttered proudly over airfields once forbidden by Versailles. In this new world, Hanna Reitsch became its perfect messenger. Not through speeches, but through flight. A star for the new Germany. By her late 20s, Hanna had broken nearly every record a woman could. She had flown longer, higher and farther than any of her contemporaries, earning medals in Poland, Austria, and Switzerland. But Germany wanted more than records. It wanted symbols. And Hanna, with her golden hair, confident smile, and absolute devotion to the idea of flight, became one of the regime's favourite images of reborn strength. She joined the Deutsche Forschungsanstalt für Segelflug, the German Research Institute for Gliding, working alongside the best engineers of her time. While the rest of the world debated peace, Hanna and her colleagues quietly tested machines that would one day serve war. "The Führer gives us freedom to fly," she said to a reporter in 1937. "For that, we give him our loyalty." To the public, she was an inspiration. To the generals, a weapon. The angel of the Luftwaffe. In 1938, she became the first woman officially appointed as a test pilot for the Luftwaffe. Her assignments included aircraft so new and unstable that even experienced men refused to take them off the ground. She flew them anyway. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Heinkel prototypes, experimental dive bombers, each one tested the limits of technology and the human body. She crashed more than once. In 1937, her plane's engine failed mid-flight over Rechlin. The wings tore apart. She hit the ground at over 100 miles per hour. Her skull fractured, jaw shattered, ribs broken. But she survived. Doctors called it a miracle. She called it a lesson. I learned that fear is the last enemy a pilot must kill. When Hermann Goering awarded her the Iron Cross, second class, she accepted it with quiet pride, her arm raised in salute. The newsreels captured that image, a smiling woman beside Luftwaffe officers, sunlight on her bandaged head. And Germany fell in love with experimenting with what no human had ever flown before, rockets and jet aircraft. Hanna volunteered for every prototype. The engineers called her reckless. She called herself curious. Her most dangerous mission came with the Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet, the world's first rocket-powered fighter. It could reach speeds of over 800 kilometers per hour, faster than any pilot could react. On one test flight, the fuel line ruptured, igniting the cockpit. Flames burst through the canopy. The aircraft exploded before hitting the ground. Hanna bailed out at the last possible second, her parachute barely opening. She landed burned and unconscious, but alive. When she awoke in the hospital, Goering himself visited her bedside. "My dear Fraulein Reitsch," he said, "you are the bravest of us all." "No," she replied weakly, "only the most stubborn." Hero or instrument? Her legend grew with every crash. Children wrote her letters. Newspapers called her the angel of the Luftwaffe. But behind the myth, there was exhaustion. She had lost friends, colleagues, entire squadrons. She knew the Reich's dream was dark, yet she refused to look down. Her mother once wrote to her, "You chase the sky, but remember, heaven is not up there." Hanna never replied. To her, the sky was still pure, untouched by ideology. But the wings she flew on now bore swastikas, and purity had long since burned away. The higher she rose, the more she belonged to the clouds, and to the men who used them to wage war. She didn't see it yet, but the same engines that carried her would soon carry Germany into fire. Berlin, 1942. The war was no longer a promise. It was a storm, and Hanna Reitsch flew through its heart. Her name was now known across the Reich, her face printed on propaganda posters beside Messerschmitts and swastikas. To a nation drowning in smoke and ruin, she was proof that courage still existed. But courage, when harnessed to a lie, becomes something else. The favourite of the Führer. In February 1943, Hanna was invited to the Wolfslair, Hitler's heavily guarded headquarters in East Prussia. She was nervous, not from fear of the man, but from reverence. When she entered the dimly lit room, he stood waiting, frail yet intense, eyes fixed on her uniform. "So," he said softly, "this is the girl who flies like the wind itself." "I only fly because Germany allows me to," she answered. He smiled, a rare, unsettling expression. They spoke for an hour. He asked about her crushes, her fears, her dreams. She described how during one test flight the world blurred into silver light, how it felt like touching eternity. He listened in silence, then said, "You understand sacrifice, Fräulein Reitsch. That makes you a true National Socialist." That moment sealed her fate. Hanna left the wolf's lair radiant, convinced she had been chosen for something greater. She would later write, "He was the loneliest man I had ever met, yet his presence filled the room. To me he seemed burdened not with evil, but with destiny." Between genius and madness, her next assignments pushed beyond sanity. The Luftwaffe's engineers began developing suicide weapons, prototypes meant for pilots who would not return. Among them, the Reichenberg 4, a piloted version of the V-1 flying bomb. The concept was simple: strap a human inside a missile, launch it toward an enemy target, and let gravity finish the work. Hanna volunteered. Her colleagues were horrified. One shouted, "You'll be killed before you even reach the target." She only smiled. "If my life helps Germany win, then it's a flight worth taking." She flew the first manned trials herself. The Reichenberg shuddered violently at takeoff. The pulse jet engine howled like a beast. She barely managed to land it alive. The landing gear collapsed and the cockpit split open. Kept flying. Every new project drew her deeper into the machine of the Reich. A machine that no longer served science, only desperation. Berlin burning. By 1944, the tide of war had turned. Bombers darkened the skies above Berlin. Cities burned night after night. And yet, in the midst of collapse, Hanna continued to fly, testing new designs for an air force that no longer existed. When Goering demanded reports on the Reichenberg suicide program, she defended it fiercely. "It is not suicide," she argued. "It is sacrifice." But even he dismissed her. Germany needs living pilots, not martyrs. Still, she refused to abandon her cause. She returned to the airfield the next morning, strapped herself into another prototype, and took off. One more flight toward nothing. The meeting in the bunker. In April 1945, as the Red Army closed around Berlin, Hanna received a final summons. She flew into the dying capital in a small Fieseler Storch, landing under fire on the Tiergarten Road. The streets were in flames. Civilians ran through smoke and rubble, clutching suitcases and children. She walked through the wreckage to the Führer bunker. Hitler was waiting, surrounded by silence and loyal ghosts. He looked older, smaller, but his eyes were the same. She saluted. He nodded. They spoke for nearly half an hour. He thanked her for her service. She begged him to escape, offered to fly him out herself, even as the Russians closed in. He refused. "I will not leave Berlin," he said. "A captain does not abandon his ship." Before she left, he gave her a small vial of cyanide. "For when the time comes," he said. She carried it with her, not as a weapon, but as a relic. A sky that no longer existed. The next morning she flew out of Berlin, the last person ever to escape the city by air before its fall. As her plane rose over the burning skyline, she looked down at what was left of the Reich she had once believed in. Later she wrote, "The city looked peaceful from above. Only from the sky can destruction look beautiful." She landed in Rechlin again, exhausted and hollow. Her faith had survived everything, except victory. She had flown through glory, through fire, through madness, and found nothing left to work. 1944. The German Reich was bleeding out, yet its heart still beat, erratic, desperate, and delusional. Factories ran on slave labor, generals lied to generals, and scientists tried to turn dying dreams into weapons. Among them stood Hanna Reitsch, her flight suit torn, her faith unbroken. To her, defeat was unthinkable. If Germany was falling, she would go down with it, in flight. The birth of the Reichenberg. In late 1944, the Luftwaffe authorized a radical project under Otto Skorzeny and Werner Baumbach, a piloted version of the V-1 flying bomb. They called it Project Reichenberg. The concept was part engineering, part madness, a human-guided missile that could strike Allied ships or bridges with pinpoint accuracy. No one volunteered, except Hanna. She was already famous for testing the Me-163 Comet, the first rocket-powered fighter, Now, she demanded to be included in Reichenberg. The engineers refused. "It's a suicide machine," they told her. "Then it's the purest form of flight," she answered. They finally gave in. If anyone could control the uncontrollable, it was her. Trial by fire. The first test took place at Lars airfield, under heavy secrecy. The Reichenberg was small, brutal. A steel coffin with wings, a pulse jet engine strapped to its back, and just enough space for one human soul. Hanna climbed in, checked the rudder, the throttle, the release lever. The technicians hesitated to start the countdown. She nodded calmly. "If I die," she said, "make sure it flies again." The V-1 screamed to life. The launch sled catapulted it into the sky. The vibration was deafening, every bolt shaking like a heartbeat. Within seconds, the craft began to pitch and roll uncontrollably. Ground control shouted for her to eject. She didn't. At the last possible moment, she cut the engine, glided the machine into a crash landing, and survived with a fractured skull and shattered nose. When the soldiers reached her wreck, she was laughing. "It works," she said through blood. "It just hates being alive." Fanatic faith. Word of her test reached Berlin. The propaganda ministry wanted to film her recovery, refused to evacuate. She spent days wandering the hangars, touching the wrecks, as if saying goodbye to fallen friends. Colleagues noticed her exhaustion. She spoke little, ate less, and spent hours writing in her notebook. One entry read, "When men die for love or belief, we call them heroes. When women do, we call them lost." Her once clear ideals had turned to ash, but she couldn't stop flying. Not because she believed in victory, but because she didn't know how to stop. The suicide flight that never happened. Historians later debated whether Hanna truly intended to fly a kamikaze mission for Hitler. Some say she volunteered in words only. Others claim she begged to lead the first squadron herself. Whatever the truth, she was willing. And that willingness was enough. In April 1945, when Berlin fell into chaos, she took one final flight. Not toward the enemy, but into the dying capital itself. The same Fieseler Stork that carried her in would carry her out, the last plane to leave the city alive. That flight became her legend. She didn't die in the sky, but she left part of herself there, forever. The aftermath of belief. When she reached Allied lines, she was arrested. To her surprise, the American officer who interrogated her asked, "Why? Why did you follow him to the end?" She looked at him, exhausted, her face pale against the bandages. "Because he gave me the sky." It wasn't an excuse, it was her truth, and that truth haunted her for the rest of her life. The woman who defied gravity had finally fallen, not from the air, but from grace. Her greatest flight was the one that never left the ground. Germany, May 1945. The Reich was gone. The flags were torn down, the radios silent, the airfields reduced to fields of twisted metal and ash. And in the middle of this wreckage, Hanna Reitsch, the woman who once ruled the sky, found herself grounded for the first time in her life. She was captured near Salzburg, her flight suit still stained with oil and dried blood. An American officer who recognized her said quietly, "So you're the famous lady pilot?" She nodded, proud even in defeat. "Not famous," she said, "just alive." But in the days that followed, even that seemed uncertain. The interrogation. Her cell was small, a single cot, a window barred with iron, and a view of mountains she once flew over freely. The Allies wanted information about German rocket programs, about secret projects, about her meetings with Hitler. They expected arrogance. They got composure. The interrogator, a young American captain, asked, "You met Hitler in the bunker. Did he seem insane?" She looked at him evenly. No more insane than any man who refuses to surrender his faith. "You still admire him?" "I pity him." He studied her for a moment and then asked softly, "Do you feel guilty?" "For what?" she replied. "For flying?" He didn't answer. Each session ended the same way, with her calm, precise voice describing test flights, crash sequences, altitudes. She spoke about aircraft, never about politics. To her, war was an equation of lift and drag, nothing more. The weight of the ground. When they finally let her outside, she could barely walk. The months of strain had weakened her body. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "I thought I'd never see it again." But the sky didn't belong to her anymore. It was filled with foreign planes, American C-47s, British Mosquitoes, symbols of victory that left contrails across her humiliation. For the first time, she understood what it meant to lose the sky, not to gravity, but to guilt. Letters from a Dead World. During her captivity, Hanna wrote long letters to her family, to friends, to herself. The Red Cross carried some, most were never sent. One fragment, later found among her belongings, read, "They think I flew for a living legend of courage and tragedy." But every story she told ended with silence. Never once did she condemn Hitler. Never once did she say she was wrong. "You want remorse," she told one interviewer, "but remorse is for those who betrayed themselves. I never did." Her voice carried neither pride nor shame, only fatigue. The cracked mirror. One evening she visited what was left of Rechlin, her old test site. The hangars were charred skeletons, the runways shattered. She stood among the ruins, the wind tugging at her coat, and whispered, "You were my cathedral." Then she laughed, a bitter, empty sound, and turned away. She was only 33, but in that moment she looked like someone who had outlived everything worth saving. A world without heroes. The newspapers no longer printed her photo. The new Germany was ashamed of its old icons. She gave a few interviews, wrote carefully worded essays, tried to separate her love of flight from the ideology that had claimed it, but she couldn't. Every plane she described carried the shadow of the swastika. Every story ended in fire. And so she began to withdraw, from fame, from people, from the earth itself. All that remained was the memory of wind and speed and silence. For the first time, the woman who had conquered gravity was forced to face its weight. She had flown above nations and wars, but no one escapes the ground forever. The war had ended, but its ghosts remained. For Hanna Reitsch, peace was not salvation. It was silence. And silence, for a woman who had lived among roaring engines and screaming wind, was the cruelest prison of all. She was no longer the angel of the Luftwaffe, no longer a national icon. Just a woman with too many medals, too many memories, and nowhere left to fly. A name that could not be erased. In post-war Germany, her name was both famous and forbidden. Some called her a heroine of aviation, others a servant of the devil. Universities invited her to speak, then cancelled under public pressure. Publishers sought her story, but demanded she repent. She never did. In 1951, she published her memoir, Fliegen, mein Leben, Flying is My Life. The book sold well, both in Germany and abroad. Its pages were filled with the poetry of flight, thermals, altitudes, the spiritual stillness of the upper air. But one chapter was missing: guilt. When asked about it in an interview, she replied, "History judges the victors kindly. I do not explain. I fly." To some, it sounded proud. To others, terrifying. Return to the sky. Though banned from piloting in Germany for years, Hanna eventually regained her license through the Aero Club of India. There, far from the ruins of Europe, she found skies untouched by her past. In 1952, she broke several new glider records, again, the first woman to do so. She became an instructor, training young Indian pilots, and even taught Indira Gandhi's husband to fly. She laughed again, though the laughter sounded brittle, as if carried on thin air. "I was born for flight," she told a journalist. "The air has no politics, only freedom." But freedom, like flight, is never weightless, the unforgiven. In Germany, she remained an uncomfortable figure. Other Luftwaffe veterans faded quietly into civilian life. She refused to fade at all. She gave lectures defending ordinary Germans, not the regime, she insisted, but the spirit of those who built and dreamed. Her words walked a narrow line between defiance and denial. One British journalist asked her, Do you still believe in hit? To some, Hanna Reitsch was a pioneer, one of the most skilled test pilots in history, a woman who defied every boundary in a world built for men. To others, she was proof that genius without conscience becomes complicity. Her technical contributions remain undeniable. Aerodynamic studies that shaped modern aviation, records that stand decades later. But so does the shadow, the image of a smiling woman saluting a dictator, believing she flew for glory when she flew for ruin. Her story is not one of villains or saints, it's one of tragedy, a reminder that passion, unmoored from morality, can make monsters out of dreamers. She loved the sky so fiercely that she could not see the fire beneath it, and in the end, the fire swallowed everything, her country, her ideals, her innocence. But still, her legend flies, part miracle, part warning, forever caught between heaven and hell.